At the close of the 19th century, Vienna presented to the world a picture of ordered elegance and dignified gaiety. But beneath the surface, the corruption and hollowness of the late Habsburg Empire produced widespread and deep-seated confusion, and so set the stage for some of the profoundest meditations on the nature of human experience that this century has yet produced. This was the scene of the intellectual and artistic struggles of many of the seminal minds of the 20th century. Among them, the writers Karl Kraus and Robert Musil, the poet Georg Trakl, the architects Otto Wagner and Adolf Loos, the painters Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele and Oskar Kokoschka, the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, the musicians Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg, and the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is a film about the work of two of these men whose lives and ideas run parallel in the development of Viennese radicalism, and in a most striking way: Ludwig Wittgenstein and Arnold Schoenberg. I said once, perhaps rightly, the earlier culture will become a heap of rubble and finally a heap of ashes. But spirits will hover over the ashes. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Both men emerged from the turmoil of the Habsburg Empire in its closing days with the idea of analyzing language and purging it with critical intent, believing that in the analysis and purification of language lies the greatest hope that we have. They never met and might never have fully understood one another, because by the nature of their genius, they found themselves alone, breaking new ground at the very frontiers of their respective disciplines. But their work springs from the same soil and shares a common ethical purpose, so that their ideas and methods echo and illuminate those of each other to a remarkable degree. Around the turn of the century, a sense of impending disaster and a growing awareness of the ideological and moral confusions of the time produced in the work of all of the Viennese modernists a common quest for a new honesty and authenticity of communication and a vital concern with language as the vehicle of human expression. And so the nature of language, in life and in art, became the prime concern of a whole generation of critical artists and thinkers, in the movement that became known as Viennese modernism. The progress of the movement is clearly reflected in the changing face of contemporary Vienna, in particular in the buildings of Adolf Loos, which broke so dramatically with the past and caused such major social uproar. The central ring in Vienna had long reflected in its architectural style the attitudes of Viennese culture. So much so that by the turn of the century, opposition to Ringstrassenstil, as it was known, had made architecture the focal point of an entire critical movement. In the words of Hermann Bahr, director of the Burgtheater, "Just walk across the ring, and you will have the impression of being in the midst of a cheap carnival. Everything masked, everything disguised. But life has become too serious for that sort of thing. A building should not conceal its intended purpose, but serve and express that purpose clearly. To disguise it behind borrowed forms seems to us both silly and ugly." In earlier times, people used to require that a building should look like something. We demand that it should be something. The work of the architect and town planner Otto Wagner, who designed this building for the Austrian Postal Savings Bank shortly after the turn of the century, soon came to be seen as the antithesis of Ringstrassenstil, and established him as one of the fathers of modern architecture. And he laid the foundations for the work of Adolf Loos. In painting, the compelling need for change expressed itself even more dramatically as a movement of protest. The work of Gustav Klimt and the painters of the Secession is deliberately and unmistakably a protest against the pervading spirit of historicism. The Secession building where they exhibited boldly states the aims of the movement. To the age its own art, and to art its freedom. The paintings of Gustav Klimt demonstrate an energetic search for a new language and a new message in art, leading towards the exploration of psychic states and away from representation. This heralded a fundamental change in the function of art, a new concern with instinctual life, the wish to penetrate the facade in search of the psyche. A movement that was to become increasingly radical in the paintings of Egon Schiele and Oskar Kokoschka. And was to manifest itself with such startling force in both the painting and the music of Arnold Schoenberg between 1908 and the outbreak of the First World War. In his music, Schoenberg set himself a task that echoed the spirit of the whole of Viennese modernism: to purify music of ornamentation and the inherited meaning of tonality, and to create a new music in which the absolute logic of composition would become pure expression. For Schoenberg, as for so many of the Viennese artists, cultural crisis made the purification of language a cultural and artistic necessity. In this way, the critique of language lies at the very heart of Viennese modernism, and these concerns with the logic and the limits of language were to find their supreme philosophical expression in the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was born in 1889 into a Viennese family of Jewish extraction and one of the wealthiest families in Austria. His father, Karl Wittgenstein, had built up the Austrian steel industry with exceptional success and patronized the arts in a grand manner, but with a very rare degree of commitment and intelligence. He was on intimate terms with most of the leading artists and intellectuals of his time, including Joseph Joachim and Johannes Brahms, and he contributed massively to the Vienna secession in its earliest revolutionary years. He even paid for the building itself. In time, however, his son Ludwig was to give his entire fortune away, part of it to the leading painters and poets of the day, and in such absolute anonymity that they themselves never knew that Ludwig Wittgenstein was their benefactor. Among them, Trakl and Rilke, Schiele and Kokoschka. A man of astounding asceticism, he built himself the remotest retreat conceivable, high on an isolated rock face at the end of the Sognefjord in Norway. A hut, accessible only by rowing boat and an arduous climb. Here he would remain alone for weeks at a time, struggling with the ideas that were later to appear in his astonishing philosophical work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. When he finally came to write the work, he did so under even stranger circumstances. It was written under fire in the trenches on the Eastern Front during the First World War. He set out to define the limits of the intelligible, not by discursive or sequential argument, but by a series of propositions designed to map precisely the limits of linguistic expression. He sought a way in which to see the world aright, as if from a point in eternity. And the work is a dream of total clarity in which all philosophical problems are dissolved. In November 1918, he was taken prisoner with the manuscript of the Tractatus in his pocket. It had accompanied him throughout the war, and in March of the following year, he wrote to Bertrand Russell, with whom he had worked in Cambridge, from a prisoner of war camp at Monte Cassino in Italy. I have written a book containing all my work of the last 6 years. I believe that I have solved all our problems finally. This may sound arrogant, but I can't help believing it. I finished the book in August 1918, and 2 months after that was made prisoner. I wish I could send it to you, but you would not understand it without a previous explanation, as it is written in quite short remarks. This, of course, means that nobody will understand it, although I believe it is as clear as crystal. But it upsets all our theories of truth, of classes, of numbers, and all the rest. I can hardly imagine seeing you again. It will be too much. I suppose that it would be impossible for you to come and see me here. Or perhaps you think it's a colossal cheek for me even to think of such a thing. But if you were on the other end of the world, and I could come to you, I would do it. Think of me often. Ever yours, Ludwig Wittgenstein. In its form, The Tractatus is unlike that of any other work in Western philosophy. The writing is oracular and extremely dense. It is presented as a series of 7 propositions with numbered subdivisions, and the extraordinary combination of brevity and breadth of scope has made the Tractatus at once the most difficult, the most misunderstood, and perhaps the most influential philosophical work of the 20th century. Wittgenstein had attempted to define the limits of the sayable in the conviction that everything that can be said clearly. He was concerned to dispel the belief that questions about the meaning of life could be captured in language. If only one does not try to utter the unutterable, then nothing will be lost. Language, he said, could only depict states of affairs in the world. It could not express ultimate meaning, for that lies outside the facts, and so outside the world. He had proposed the idea that the limits of our language define the limits of our world, but that the meaning of the world, or of life, lies beyond the limits of language, and therefore is inexpressible in words. This was the realm which Wittgenstein called the mystical, and the Tractatus ends with the demanding proposition that in the face of the inexpressible, we should remain silent. While fighting in a war that was to end a long phase of European culture, Wittgenstein had written a work which absconded from history and sought life in eternity, not in time. The book appears to deal solely with symbolic logic and the nature of the linguistic proposition, and was understood by Bertrand Russell in just that way. But its fundamental concern is with ethics and aesthetics, as Wittgenstein himself pointed out when trying to get the work published. The point of the book is an ethical one. It does not deal expressly with ethical questions, however, because for Wittgenstein at this period, there can be no sentences about ethics. Ethics and aesthetics, just as the meaning of the world and of art, are beyond the reach of language. Art, on the other hand, is a way of capturing the world and revealing something of its meaning. In this way, art can force us to a right perspective. In accord with the whole thrust of the Viennese modernist movement, Wittgenstein believed that the artwork should not depict anything or be an expression of subjective intention. What the artwork should do is to exhibit a meaning that is not expressible in words. And he shared with Arnold Schoenberg the conviction that art should not be decoration or entertainment, but the profoundest form of knowledge that we have. The parallels between Schoenberg's thinking and the ideas expressed in the Tractatus are both striking and illuminating. Just as Wittgenstein sought the logic inherent in ordinary language, so Schoenberg sought the essence of music in the logic of composition. Both men are radical innovators in the understanding and use of language, seeking a meaning in art beyond subjective intention generated by the language of the artwork itself. From this, Schoenberg created the new concept of the relationship between art and its language, which brought about a fundamental change in the function of musical expression. His achievements are prodigious. He was largely self-taught, which in music is unusual enough on its own. But very soon, the rigorous logic of his thinking and his extraordinary understanding of compositional procedures were to make him the most influential musician and teacher of the 20th century. The autodidact who became the most inspired pedagogue of his time. He was born on the 13th of September 1874, to parents of no particular musical interests or talent who ran a small shoe shop in Vienna. But he began nevertheless to learn the violin at the age of 8 and to listen intently to violin duets and military bands in the public gardens. Soon he began to imitate them in compositions of his own, and by his early 20s he was writing chamber music with a strong contrapuntal character and an advanced and daring use of chromatic harmony. Most notably his sextet, Transfigured Night, which he wrote in 1899. But after the turn of the century, Schoenberg moved steadily away from the Romantic aesthetic in a search for a new authenticity in music, which would dispense with decoration and conventional rhetoric in an absolute unity of sound and expression. Here Schoenberg and Wittgenstein echo each other to a remarkable degree, each of them trusting in the revelations of language. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein had written, "What expresses itself in language, we cannot express by means of language. How words are understood is not told by words alone." This captures precisely the aesthetic program of the music that Arnold Schoenberg was writing in 1909. It has come to be known as his atonal music, although he himself disliked the term and showed quite clearly that it could never serve as an adequate description of what he was doing. The new music is, like the Tractatus, a dream of absolute communication, a music in which passions are no longer simulated or represented, but genuine expressions of the unconscious. In the words of the painter Wassily Kandinsky, a new realm in which musical experience is a matter not of sound, but of the soul alone. From this point, says Kandinsky, begins the music of the future. The third of the Opus 11 piano pieces was completed on the 7th of August 1909, a significant date in the history of music. This was the first instrumental composition to dispense entirely with the tonal means of organization. And in abandoning the use of the tonal center, Schoenberg had dissolved the structures from which Western music had derived much of its sense of shape and order for 400 years. However, he said again and again that he had not gone willingly or easily into the unknown. He had felt himself under the command of higher powers in a natural historical process. By freeing himself from the key system and the convention of resolving dissonance, he felt that he had taken the next logical step in a long progression of harmonic developments. A process that had been accelerated in the music of Wagner, Debussy, Richard Strauss, Mussorgsky and Mahler, until finally Schoenberg himself set the seal on what he called the emancipation of dissonance, and so brought to an end an epoch in European music. In a brief and extraordinarily productive period, marking the highest point in musical expressionism and in his own creativity, Schoenberg produced a series of masterpieces which signaled a turning point in the history of Western music. But the expressionist dream was soon to fade. In the desolation of war-torn Europe, the heroic attempt at a new beginning seemed, for Schoenberg, to lose much of its relevance. The order which he had so effectively challenged had suddenly been swept away forever, and the preoccupations with self and the direct expression of the subconscious began to give way to a search for something of a higher order. In a letter to Kandinsky, he later recalled the beginnings of this new quest. "I expect you know that we have had our trials here too. Famine. It was appalling. But perhaps the worst was the overturning of everything that one has believed in. That was probably the most grievous thing of all. For a man to whom ideas have always been everything, this means nothing less than the total collapse of things. Unless he has come to find support in a belief in something higher, something beyond." During the war, and in the 5 years following, Schoenberg published nothing at all, and Wittgenstein, after the Tractatus, abandoned philosophy for more than a decade. Both men had fallen silent. There is no parallel in the history of Western philosophy with Ludwig Wittgenstein. No other philosopher who has lived out the terms of his own philosophy to the same degree. Because with Wittgenstein, his life and thought are in a very real sense one and the same. Certainly there is no philosopher of such accomplishment who could have given up philosophy completely through the conviction that he had solved all the problems with which he was concerned. But that is what happened. The author of the Tractatus fell silent and lived out his silence as a primary school teacher in Lower Austria and in extremely simple conditions. It was not until he began to look at the same problems from a different point of view that he would take up philosophy again, apparently with an entirely new idea. His silence was to last for 10 years, but during this period he worked between 1926 and 1928 on the design and construction of a house in Vienna for his sister Margarete Stonborough. Believing her brother to have been in personal crisis since the end of the war, and yet believing that he could achieve anything to which he applied himself, his sister had suggested the idea as a form of therapy. Although the project began in association with the architect Paul Engelmann, Wittgenstein soon took it over entirely and began to sign himself Wittgenstein, architect. Remember the impression one gets from good architecture, that it expresses a thought. It makes one want to respond with a gesture. Once again, he had broken new ground. The interior of the building is unique in 20th century architecture. Nothing is taken from established architectural theories or forms. It was described by his sister as house-embodied logic. But even this apt, if startling description does less than justice to Wittgenstein's achievement. He gave himself entirely, in his customary way, to the design of every detail as much as to the whole, and every aspect of the house embodies his logical and rigorous thinking. He had again set out to criticize a degenerate form of expression, and to give shape and form to his ideas in the logic and the language of construction. And once again, he had succeeded. The result is one of the notable monuments to the 20th century. In 1929, the year following the construction of the house in Vienna, Wittgenstein returned to the University of Cambridge to work on the development of his new philosophical ideas. He had studied here with Bertrand Russell between 1911 and 1913, and within a year had had a decisive impact on Russell's work in logic. As Russell himself was later to put it, Wittgenstein persuaded me that what wanted doing in logic was too difficult for me, and philosophy lost its hold on me. Now Wittgenstein himself was to move away from formal logic as a means of explaining the significance and scope of language. The Tractatus had embodied a fundamental idea that all languages have an underlying and uniform logical structure which might be discovered by philosophical and logical inquiry. And Wittgenstein had proposed the thought that the structure of language pictures the structure of reality. But this conviction had begun to wane during his 10 years away from formal philosophy. He began to feel now that the reverse was true, that our language actually determines our view of reality. And he began to see the importance of language in its very diversity as the bearer of tradition and custom. His prime concern was still with the limits of language. But instead of deducing his conclusions by logic from a single theory, as he had done in the Tractatus, he now set out to discover those limits by empirical investigation of the way in which language functions in society as a part of human life. In the Tractatus, he had sought a common essence in all languages. But now he speaks of countless forms of language, which he describes as language games, and which we use as tools for apprehending the world. In this way, he sees the philosophical grammar of language as the grammar of the life of humanity. The change in perspective is significant but subtle, and he felt strongly that the second philosophy should be printed together with the first, because he believed that it could only be intelligible as an extension of his earlier work. He remained true to the conviction, expressed in the Tractatus, that philosophy is an activity, not a doctrine, but he comes now to stress its critical and therapeutic intent. He felt himself at odds with the spirit of contemporary European and American civilization, and he saw the task of the new philosophy as one of exposing the disorder in language, and hence in the life of the community. He was deeply disturbed by what he felt to be the decline in European culture. Passing a bookshop one day, he saw in the window portraits of Russell, Einstein, and Freud, and shortly afterwards, in a music shop, portraits of Beethoven, Schubert, and Chopin. And he said that he felt intensely the degeneration of the human spirit that had taken place in only 100 years. His sense of alienation flowed primarily from the belief that Western civilization had accepted a general faith in science as a solution to the problems of life. People nowadays think that scientists exist to instruct them, while poets and musicians exist to give them pleasure. The idea that the latter have something to teach them, that does not occur to them. It is striking how often Wittgenstein turns to music when investigating the functioning of language, in the conviction that understanding a musical phrase is akin to understanding a language. What happens, Wittgenstein asks, when we learn to feel the ending of a church mode as an ending? And he invites the answer: the historical practice of European music has codified itself in rules with which we have grown familiar. And so music is the expression of its own history and of the life of mankind. Wittgenstein's new perspective and his new focus on cultural history has strong parallels once again with the developing work and ideas of Arnold Schoenberg. Just as Wittgenstein's philosophical inquiry had shifted from the idea of a given logic in language to an investigation of the way in which language functions in everyday use, so Schoenberg turned from the search for direct expression through the logic of composition to the idea of a new and better musical order that would give a new relevance to music in the 20th century. On a walk with his pupil, Josef Rufer, in 1921, he announced that he had made a discovery which would assure the preeminence of German music for the next 100 years. A statement not so much of national pride as of artistic aspiration. He had been working on the idea since 1917, and in the summer of 1921, on holiday on the Traunsee in the Austrian Salzkammergut, he composed the prelude to the Opus 25 piano suite, the first composition in what has come to be known as serial technique, or composition with 12 tones. had come to recognize that the compositions of the atonal period, while freeing music from its inherited limitations, had, by the very process of innovation, destroyed much as well. New and colourful harmony had been won, but much had been lost in the process. And in particular, possibilities for development had been sacrificed. The 12 notes of the chromatic scale had of course always been there in tonal music. It was the organising principle of the key system that had been broken down by the process of increasing dissonance. And so now he set out in serialism to replace the 7 notes of the diatonic scale with all 12 notes of the chromatic scale, but in a prearranged order. He hoped by this to guarantee both unity and the possibility of continuous development within the structure of the piece. Apart from that, he felt that composition should proceed along the same lines as it had always done, and pursue the same ends. The same impulse which lay behind the music of the brave atonal period is still there. To free music from the limitations of conventions that had lost their meaning in a changed world. But in place of the defiant, heroic gesture of the artist trusting in the force of his own unconscious, Schoenberg had now taken on the even more heroic task of finding and codifying a new language for music which aspired to a higher order. If people speak of me, they at once connect me in horror with atonality and with composition with 12 tones. Perhaps they do not sufficiently consider that I am trying to say something which cannot be so easily or immediately grasped. By the most advanced analysis of Western music ever undertaken, Schoenberg had shown why the compositional procedures of the past had lost their power and relevance for the 20th century composer. But now, like Wittgenstein, he too directed a new attention to tradition and custom. And he set out to integrate the advances of his early work with the inheritance of the 18th and 19th centuries. He saw in this the possibility of preserving the integrity of the great central tradition of Western European music, and it became his most pressing concern. He felt intensely the need to contribute both to the development and to the continuity of the European musical tradition. And he saw serialism as the most effective way possible of continuing the exploration of musical ideas within that tradition from Bach to the present day. I do not attach so much importance to being a musical bogeyman as to being a natural continuer of properly understood good old tradition. But at the same time, he foresaw with disturbing clarity the hostility that his work would provoke, and it made him fiercely defensive. Hearing one day that a famous conductor did not conduct his music because he did not understand it, he responded, "Why did he have to pick on me in this sudden burst of wanting to understand? He has been conducting the classics for years without understanding." Schoenberg and the Viennese modernists had attacked the bogus traditionalism of a society doomed to extinction. But when destruction came, so irrevocably and so soon, the greatest revolutionary mind in 20th century music came to seek ways of preserving tradition in a new context, with music that is radically new in its language, but organically linked to the past in its content. That is the delicate synthesis that constitutes Arnold Schoenberg's conservative revolution. He began even to see the role of the composer in a different light, as much prophet as artist. An attitude conditioned in part by the First World War, and then by the rise of Nazism, which cost him his post at the Berlin Academy and finally forced him to flee for his life. For some years, he had been exploring Jewish themes in his work, and in Paris in 1933, already in exile, he returned to the faith of his fathers and rejoined the Jewish religious community. He had embarked on an immense spiritual quest, to reinterpret in a higher and better order not only his own previous experience, but the very course of musical history itself, as he knew and profoundly understood it. He declared his teachers in this to have been Bach and Mozart in the first place, and Beethoven, Wagner, and Brahms in the second. And so the birth of serialism was both a reintegration of history and a development from Schoenberg's atonal music, not a retreat from it. It is in this that the true measure of his greatness lies. And if, in the opening bars of the Largo from his last quartet, there are unmistakable echoes from the Jewish liturgy, they represent, not as some have suggested, the retreat of a failing spirit from the brave gestures of 1909, but a statement of faith in our creative traditions, and a courageous cry from the heart of this most passionate of musicians. And although the goal towards which I am striving appears to me a certain one, I am nonetheless already feeling the resistance that I shall have to overcome. I feel how passionately even the meanest of temperaments will rise in revolt against me, and I suspect that even those who have so far believed in me will not want to acknowledge the necessary nature of this development. And so it happened that the state in which nobody ever said what they meant, to use the words of Robert Musil, produced in time a generation of critical artists and thinkers determined to say clearly exactly what they meant, and to find new ways in which to say it. Among them, two astonishingly creative temperaments, whose courageous efforts to contribute to European culture have altered the course of that culture forever. As young men, both made bold strides into the unknown, and with lasting effect. The languages of the new philosophy and the new music reflected a world transformed almost beyond recognition. But at the same time, they embodied a sharply critical intention and paved the way for a new epoch in European history. But both men then found themselves at odds with the spirit of contemporary European civilization, and for a time, both fell silent. Their work then became a struggle against what Wittgenstein called the darkness of this time. Critical of the present, but in deep awe of the achievements of the past, both men sought to define a spiritual attitude which would reanimate those achievements in order to give sense and purpose to the present. They lived out the terms of their own philosophies to a degree that few have ever achieved. Both struggled for a lifetime without fear or compromise to answer the questions which they found before them, and in so doing, they changed the course of European thought. Both then died in exile, Ludwig Wittgenstein in Cambridge and Arnold Schoenberg in Los Angeles, and both in the same year, 1951. They are, without question, among the principal architects of the imagination of our time, although it is arguable that to this day the real meaning of their work has not yet been fully comprehended. Certainly, both are more imitated for their technical innovations than understood in the spirit of their work. It is nevertheless true that Arnold Schoenberg shaped the evolution of modern music more decisively than any other modern musician. It may even be said that without Schoenberg, most of modern music as we know it would not have come into being. And similarly, Ludwig Wittgenstein's conviction that all philosophy is a critique of language has dominated the philosophical consciousness of the Western world in the 20th century.